I feel like I've talked a lot about the Avars while talking about the careers of many of the Byzantine emperors and a lot of the history of this period. So I thought that it was only fair to really sort of give a look at their history and talk about the impact of the Avars on history. So without any further ado, let's dig right in and talk about the Avar Khaganate. The Avars first popped onto the view screen of history when they arrived on the Danubian frontier of the Byzantine Empire in 557 and agreed to serve as allies of the Byzantines against their various enemies in that region. The Avars always followed a grand leader called the Khagan. This is a title which is fairly similar to that of many other steppe peoples, and there are other groups that we might encounter who have a similar or the same title for their leaders. We actually don't know the names of many of the Khagans. We do know some of their names, but not all of them. And actually the most important of the Khagans, the guy who laid siege to Constantinople, is someone whose name we actually don't have, which is a fairly surprising omission. Prior to their arrival, the Avars were nomadic, and even after they became a settled people with a defined territory, they remained a very horse-centered warrior culture. So far as we can tell, the primary arms of Avar warriors were composite bows and curved swords, which really points to their nomadic heritage and their connections to the steppe. Culturally speaking, they're not all that dissimilar to the Slavs and many of their other neighbors. However, linguistically, it is possible that they're a bit more related to Mongolian and various steppe languages like Turkic. However, because their culture intermingled for so long with their neighbors, including neighbors both Slavic and steppe, it is possible that their language over time evolved to the point where it gives off some false resonances and it's hard to really recapture what their original language was like. The fact that they never really developed their own written language is obviously a pretty big impediment to better understanding their origins. Settling to the north of the Danube, bordering the Black Sea, the Avars were now in the realm of the Byzantines. By this point, the Balkans were more or less the Byzantine homeland, since this is where many, if not most, of the soldiers in the imperial army were recruited. And accordingly, the Byzantine emperors saw the peoples to the north as their subordinates and really tried to stage manage affairs to maintain a balance of power and prevent any of these groups from posing a major threat to the empire the way that the Goths had in the 4th century or the Huns had in the 5th century. So what they would do is set groups against each other through diplomacy, subsidies, alliances, marriages, and other means in order to maintain a balance of power which left the empire as the single strongest player in the region. Now, they also have some other rivals in addition to the empire. So the main rivals for the Avars at this period of their history are the Gepids, the Lombards, the Slavs, who will remain a major part of their life for the rest of their existence pretty much, and possibly even some small remnants of the Huns here and there, who are still reported on occasion. When the Avars first arrived on the scene, the dominant power in the area north of the Danube was the Gepid Confederacy. Now, the Gepids were a people not all that dissimilar to the Avars, and during the time of Justinian I, which in this context would be from 557 when the Avars pop on the scene until his death in 565, the normal policy was for the empire to align itself with the Avars and the Gepids in order to maintain a balance of power. The Gepids being stronger than either the Lombards or the Avars, this meant that the empire would give just enough aid to its allies to hold the Gepids back and prevent them from really achieving all that much. However, when Justin II took over from his uncle, he decided that he wanted to prove that he had better policy ideas than Justinian had. So one of the biggest mistakes of his reign is that he decided to combine Byzantine and Gepid power. And what that does is it really spooks the Avars and Lombards, who now feel like they're massively at a disadvantage, so they actually launch an all-out pincer attack with other allies in the region who are also worried about this superpower alliance, and they actually quickly overrun and completely destroy the Gepid confederacy in the year 567. So at this point, the Avars have really established themselves as power players. Within just a decade of their arrival, they've removed their second strongest neighbor, and they're the primary beneficiaries of this war. The Lombards gain a lot too, and obviously they leave for Italy and further hurt Justin II and his legacy. But what that does is then leaves the Avars as the new dominant power north of the Danube. Basically creating the exact situation that Justinian had avoided by maintaining a successful balance of power and keeping his potential enemies divided amongst themselves. The primary base for the Avars going forward will be the old Roman province of Pannonia, and from that base they will then enjoy quite a bit of success. When Justin II and Tiberius II were emperors of Byzantium, the Avars and the Slavs really thrived, and they took advantage of Byzantine weakness to raid and possibly even do some limited settlements in the area south of the Danube. Now, when Maurice took power, he spent a lot of the 580s in the east, but then after 590, his number one priority was winning the Balkans back completely, and also subjugating the Slavs and Avars, even the ones north of the Danube. And by the time that he was deposed and killed by his own men in 602, Maurice had been campaigning north of the Danube on a regular basis, and he had done considerable damage to the Avars. In fact, by 602, some Avars were beginning to swear alliance to the empire and to the emperor, and they were beginning to abandon the Khagan because they felt like their cause was lost and they were being destroyed by a superior power. However, once Maurice dies, things really start to look up for the Avars. In the short term, what Maurice's death meant to the Avars was that the Byzantine army, which was going to camp in their territory over winter, was gone. And since Phocas had led the mutiny, which got the army to abandon its post and come home, it was pretty safe to assume that even if he continued to fight the Avars, that he wasn't going to prosecute the war nearly as vigorously as his predecessor had. So that looked like pretty good news. And then things got way better for the Avars, because it turns out that the Persians used Phocas's usurpation as a great pretext for invading the Byzantine Empire. After all, Maurice had installed Chosroe II on the throne of Persia, and Chosroe thought that he could run a campaign ostensibly for vengeance in order to maybe gain a few cities from the Byzantines. So, that war is going on, and that will demand all of Byzantium's attention. So Phocas and Heraclius will both resort to the tactic of paying off the Avars and Slavs and, focusing on the east where the real problem is. And what that does is it allows the Avars to completely recover from all the damage they had suffered at the hands of Maurice. And things got to the point where they had recovered enough that they were meeting with Heraclius in 617 to talk about possibly upping the amount of money that he had to pay them every year to keep them at peace. And they hatched the scheme to try to kidnap him. And he only discovered it at the very last second and barely escaped. Had he been captured by the Avars, there's no telling what the consequences of that would have been, but they would have been very good for the Avars and very bad for the Empire. By about 620, the Avars and their allies had overrun almost the entirety of the Balkans, including a lot of cities, which is something that most barbarian invasions had previously really struggled to do. Cities are much harder to take, so this implies either that the Avars and their allies had more siege equipment, or that they were able to ravage the countryside so thoroughly that these cities were no longer able to provide for themselves and were forced to surrender. So that was a pretty major blow, and at this point the Avars are riding high, as of all the people who are now raiding the Byzantine Empire and invading it, they are considered to be the most prestigious, and generally speaking, the other groups are more or less loyal, at least in theory, to the Khagan. While the term is by no means universally used, a lot of scholars consider the period from about 630 to 800 in Byzantine history to be a dark age because there are very few contemporary sources to really illuminate events, and that leads to a lot of chronological uncertainty when it comes to some of the major institutional changes which took place during that period. And I think it's safe to say that the activities of the Avars and their subjects played a major role in bringing about this period of downturn and obscurity for the Byzantine Empire. So what ends up happening is that the Avar Khaganate is able to really end imperial control over the majority of the Balkans for a few centuries. Now, they don't really set up a state powerful enough to really become an organized and permanent rival to the Byzantines, so the Byzantines are able to maintain the fiction of control for the next few centuries. But in reality, these areas will be either under the control of small local rulers or maybe even more or less ungoverned and, just a series of independent villages. And when the Byzantines lost control of this area, it was devastating for their war efforts against Persia and later the Arabs, because this was an area that had contributed a lot of men and also some resources to the empire. Also, the loss of a lot of their major cities in this region was equally devastating because that meant that many of the areas which have been producing text and scholars were now more or less gone. One exception was actually Thessalonica, which does survive and continued to thrive, although at a slightly lesser rate since it was constantly under threat. And interestingly enough, a lot of the reason why we are somewhat ignorant about the Avars and the details of their society, the names of their Khagans, is precisely because of the amount of damage that they wrought. Had they been less successful, we would actually know more about them, because the Byzantines would have recorded more and then passed it on. The real peak of the Avars was in the 620s when they had succeeded in leading a coalition of various barbarian groups in overrunning the entirety of the Balkans. And ultimately, this ascendancy will really come crashing down because of the imperiousness of the Avar Khagan, the same one who directed the siege of Constantinople. So the exact high point of Avar history is when the Avars lead a coalition to Constantinople, and whether by a prearrangement or by opportunity, the Avars, Slavs, and Persians were all communicating and working together trying to take down the imperial capital. However, the walls of Constantinople proved to be more or less impregnable, something that wasn't really known at the time. The Slavs failed to get the Persians across, and for that the Avar Khagan was pretty incensed, and supposedly he ordered the deaths of some of the Slavic sailors who, swam back to shore after getting destroyed by the Byzantine navy, and that alienated the Slavs to a great degree. The Persians obviously left the area and went on to lose their war with the Byzantines, so they were no longer a help. So because of this, there's quite a bit of tension between the Avars and their former subjects. The Bulgars are also rising in power during this period. So within a couple years, there's a major battle fought between the Avars and their Slavic subjects, and this is a battle that the Avars lose. There's also another defeat of the at the hands of the Bulgars near the Sea of Azov in 635. So after the year 635, the Avars are just one of many powers. They're not necessarily weak, but they also aren't really strong anymore. And they're certainly not dominant. And their impact on history after this point will be fairly modest, to put it politely. They will survive as a minor power in the Pannonia region all the way up until Charlemagne's eastern campaigns during the 790s, when Charlemagne finishes them off on basically for revenge, because they had also spent some of their time attacking the Franks in the east. So that puts paid to the official history of the Avar Khaganate, but not necessarily the Avar people. So let's look at the afterlife of the Avars. As I said earlier, the influence of the Avars waned gradually after 635, and by the time they were conquered by the Franks in the 790s, they had really been reduced to a second-rate power. However, that does not mean that they disappeared or that they lost their identity as a people. So in the 10th century, the scholar Emperor Constantine VII wrote a work where he says that the Avars were still living in Croatia during his time. We also can see from archaeology that the Bulgars settled a lot of the areas where the Avars had lived, and it looks like a lot of Avars did lose their identity and blend in with the Bulgars and more or less join them culturally. There also were Avars who lived further east and converted to Islam, and they briefly formed a group called the Avar Khaganate in the Caucasus Mountains during the early 13th century. That lasted for a little while, but ultimately, didn't develop into a major power. And there actually are still Avars today who are descendants of the people who led the Avar Khaganate. And they are actually the dominant ethnic group in the Russian Republic of Dagestan, which is in the northern Caucasus between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. So ultimately, the Slavs and Bulgars are the barbarians to the north of Byzantium who will go on to have a huge impact on later medieval history. Well, them and the Hungarians who come a little later. But the Avars should not necessarily be forgotten. They played a big role also, and they still have a little bit of a legacy, maybe not quite as big or as far-reaching, but still a pretty interesting one, and I think one worth talking about.